The polished marble floors of the courthouse reflected the smug grin on Richard Hawthorne's face. On his arm wasn't his wife of 22 years, but his much younger mistress, Candace, dressed in a crimson suit that screamed for attention. To him, this day was a formality, the final nail in the coffin of a marriage he'd long since discarded. He was the king of his empire, a titan of industry, and he was about to swat away his quiet, unassuming wife with a pittance. He believed he held all the cards, every deed, every stock certificate, every offshore account. What he didn't know was that while he was building an empire in his name, his wife was building a fortress in hers. He walked into that courtroom a king, but he would crawl out a pauper stripped of everything but the cheap suit on his back. The Hawthorne estate in Oak Creek Preserve was less a home and more a monument to Richard's success. It was a sprawling mansion of cold stone and vast panes of glass that overlooked manicured lawns rolling down to a private lake. It was a place designed to be photographed for magazines, not to be lived in. And for Samantha Hawthorne, it had been a gilded cage for over 2 decades. The silence within its walls was a living entity, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of the pool filtration system, or the quiet footsteps of the hired staff who moved through the halls like ghosts. Richard Hawthorne was a man forged in the crucible of ruthless ambition. He had built his real estate development empire. Hawthorne Holdings from the ground up, crushing competitors and bending regulations with a potent combination of charisma and intimidation. He saw the world as a collection of assets to be acquired and people to be managed. His wife Samantha had long ago been relegated to the category of a decorative, low-maintenance asset. She ran the home, organized the charity galas that burnished his public image, and raised their 2 children who were now grown and gone off building lives of their own. In the early years there was warmth. There were shared dreams whispered in a small apartment that always smelled of freshly brewed coffee. But as the square footage of their homes grew, the space between them widened into a chasm. Richard's success became his only identity, and Samantha became a spectator to his life rather than a participant. His indiscretions started as whispers, then became brazen. The current one, Candace Albright, was the most flagrant of all. She was a marketing assistant from his firm, 20 years his junior, with a rapacious appetite for the lifestyle Richard could provide. He didn't even bother to hide it. He'd bring her to company events, her laughter echoing a little too loudly, her hand resting a little too long on his arm. Tonight was no different. Richard arrived home just after 10. The scent of Candace's cloying floral perfume preceded him into the grand foyer. Samantha was in the library, a book open but unread in her lap. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. She was still a handsome woman with calm grey eyes and a quiet dignity that seemed to irritate him lately. "You're home," she said, her voice even. It was not a question. Had to close the Henderson deal. Went late, he lied, loosening a tie that was already perfectly knotted. The lie was so worn and familiar, it was almost comfortable. "I see." Samantha closed her book, the soft snap echoing in the cavernous room. "There's a cold plate in the refrigerator if you're hungry." Not hungry. He walked to the bar cart, a magnificent piece of polished mahogany, and poured himself 2 fingers of scotch. He swirled the amber liquid, the ice clinking like a tiny, mournful bell. "We need to talk, Sam." Samantha's hands remained perfectly still in her lap. She had been waiting for this conversation for months, perhaps even years. She had seen it in the way he stopped looking at her, the way his phone was always angled away, the way his courtesies became liabilities he was eager to shed. All right, Richard. Let's talk. He took a large swallow of his drink, the alcohol fortifying his resolve. This isn't working anymore. It hasn't been for a long time. We're just two people living in the same house. The kids are gone. We have nothing in common. Each word was a carefully rehearsed blow, designed to sound reasonable, inevitable. He was framing it as a mutual failing, a gentle drifting apart, when in reality it was a brutal, one-sided abandonment. I want a divorce, he stated, finally getting to the point. He watched her for a reaction, tears, anger, pleading. He was prepared for all of it. He received none. Samantha simply nodded slowly. I see. Her calmness unnerved him. It wasn't the reaction of a victim. It's for the best. He pressed on, a little louder now. I'll be fair, of course. I've already spoken to my lawyer, Barry Gorman. He's drawn up a proposal. You'll be very comfortable. The condo in the city, a generous allowance. You won't have to worry about a thing. A thing, she thought, as if her entire life, the two children she raised, the home she managed, the social network she built, that he so often leveraged, was a mere thing to be paid off and dismissed. Your lawyer, she asked, her voice still impossibly serene. Yes, Gorman is the best. He handles everything for the company. It'll be clean, quick. No need to drag things through the mud. He finished his scotch and set the glass down with a definitive thud. He'll have the papers sent over to you tomorrow. He stood there expecting a response, an argument. But Samantha just looked at him, her grey eyes holding a depth he had never bothered to explore. He saw not sadness, but a flicker of something else, something he couldn't quite name. Pity, no. It was more like assessment. She was looking at him the way a geologist looks at a rock specimen, analyzing its composition and its flaws. Thank you for telling me in person, Richard, she said, her voice smooth as river stone. She stood up, her posture perfect. I'm rather tired. I think I'll go up to bed. She walked past him without another glance, her scent of clean linen and old books, a stark contrast to the cheap perfume he carried on his suit. Richard stood alone in the library, a profound sense of unease creeping into his triumph. He had expected a storm, but all he got was a quiet closing of a door. He shook his head, dismissing the feeling. She was in shock, that's all. Once she saw the settlement offer, once she realized the formidable legal power he wielded, she would fold. She had to. After all, she was just a housewife. What did she know about the real world? The next day, a courier delivered a thick envelope. Inside was the divorce petition and a settlement agreement that was, even by Richard's standards, insulting. He was offering her the downtown apartment, which she knew was technically registered to one of his subsidiary companies, and a 5-year alimony package that amounted to less than their annual landscaping budget. Everything else, the mansion, the vacation homes, the art collection, the stocks, and the entirety of Hawthorne Holdings, was listed as his sole and separate property. Samantha read the document twice, not with panic, but with a cold, methodical focus. Then she picked up her phone and made a call. "Hello, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It's Samantha Hawthorne. Richard has made his first move. It's exactly as we predicted. The offices of Gorman, Steele & Associates were the epitome of corporate intimidation. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books that looked as if they'd never been opened, and a view of the city's financial district that screamed power and influence. Richard Hawthorne sat in a plush leather armchair, exuding an air of bored impatience. His lawyer, Barry Gorman, a portly man with a bulldog's face, and a voice like gravel paced in front of the window. "She's not signing, Richard," Gorman grumbled, chewing on the end of an unlit cigar. She rejected the offer, flat out. "Didn't even make a counter." Richard scoffed. "It's a tactic. She's trying to scare us into sweetening the pot." "She'll come around." Who did she even hire? Someone from a billboard on the side of a bus. "Worse," Gorman said, stopping his pacing. He picked up a sheet of paper from his massive desk. "She's retained Alistair Finch." The name hung in the air. Richard had never heard of him. And who the hell is Alistair Finch? "Finch is not a billboard lawyer," Gorman said grimly. "He's old school, quiet, meticulous. They call him the gentleman shark. He doesn't advertise because he doesn't have to. He handles divorces for the city's old money, the kind of people who see our entire portfolio as a rounding error. He's discreet, he's brilliant, and he's devastating in a courtroom. The fact that she has him means this is not going to be the simple signing we hoped for." A flicker of irritation crossed Richard's face, but it was quickly replaced by his usual arrogance. "So he's expensive. It doesn't change the facts, Barry. The assets are in my name. The company is mine. The trusts are ironclad. I built everything. She was there, sure, but she didn't lay a single brick. A judge will see that. Let this Finch fellow send his letters. We'll bury him in paperwork." The first meeting was set for the following week. At Richard's insistence, it was held at Gorman's office, a home field advantage. Richard arrived a few minutes late. A deliberate power play with Candace waiting for him in the car downstairs. A visible trophy of the new life he was so close to securing. He strode into the conference room, expecting to see Samantha looking lost and overwhelmed. Instead, she was sitting calmly at the far end of the long mahogany table, looking perfectly composed in a simple, well-tailored navy dress. Beside her sat a man who could only be Alistair Finch. He was a tall, slender man in his late 50s, with silver hair, a bespoke suit that probably cost more than Richard's car, and the quiet, unnerving posture of a predator at rest. He stood as Richard entered, a gesture of old-world courtesy that felt more like a challenge than a welcome. "Mr. Hawthorne Finch," said his voice a low, cultured baritone. "Alistair Finch. And you know Mrs. Hawthorne." Richard gave a curt nod, avoiding Samantha's eyes, and sat opposite them next to Gorman. The tension in the room was thick enough to taste. Gorman cleared his throat and began laying out their position with blustering confidence. He spoke of Richard's generosity, the fairness of the initial offer, and the futility of a protracted legal battle. He painted Richard as the sole architect of the couple's wealth, and Samantha as a fortunate beneficiary who was now attempting to claim an unearned share. Throughout the entire speech, Finch remained silent, his hands steepled in front of him. He didn't take notes. He didn't fidget. He simply listened, his gaze fixed on Gorman with an unnerving intensity. Samantha beside him was equally still, a portrait of serene composure. When Gorman finally finished, the silence stretched on for a full 10 seconds. "Are you quite finished, Mr. Gorman?" Finch asked softly. Gorman, flustered by the lack of reaction, grunted an affirmation. "Excellent." Finch leaned forward slightly. "My client rejects your offer, not just in its specifics, but in its entire premise." He turned his calm, intelligent eyes towards Richard. "Mr. Hawthorne, you seem to be operating under a significant misapprehension. You believe this is a negotiation about how to divide your assets. We, on the other hand, are here to discuss the logistics of your departure from Mrs. Hawthorne's properties." Richard almost laughed out loud. "Her properties? What are you talking about? I bought that house. I built that company." "Did you?" Finch asked, his tone one of genuine curiosity. "Mr. Gorman, in your initial filing, you provided a schedule of assets. It is, I must say, impressively detailed. However, it seems to be missing a rather crucial document, a post-nuptial agreement signed by both Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne on June 12, 2011. Gorman froze. His eyes darted towards Richard, a question hanging in the air. Richard's mind went blank. 2011. That was over a decade ago. He had a vague memory of a difficult period. He'd been caught in a entanglement with a young architect on a project in Miami. It had been messy. Samantha had been furious, devastated. He'd done whatever it took to smooth things over to get back to business as usual. There were papers he remembered now. Something about securing her future, proving his commitment. He'd signed them without a second thought, eager to put the whole sordid affair behind him. I don't recall the specifics of any such document," Richard stammered, his bravado beginning to crack. "Allow me to refresh your memory," Finch said, sliding a single crisp document across the polished table. It slid to a halt directly in front of Richard. "My office has already filed a copy with the court. I suggest you and your counsel review it carefully." Gorman snatched the paper. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. The color drained from his face. He began to sweat, his blustering demeanor deflating like a punctured balloon. "What is it, Barry?" Richard demanded, his voice tight. Gorman didn't answer. He was staring at a clause on page 3, his mouth slightly agape. Finch smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. "We will of course require a full accounting of all expenditures from corporate and joint accounts over the past 24 months. We will also be filing a motion to have Mr. Hawthorne vacate the primary residence in Oak Creek within 30 days, pending the final dissolution. As for a settlement..." Finch paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silent room. "We believe under the terms of the agreement you so willingly signed, Mr. Hawthorne, that it is you who will be requiring a settlement from my client, not the other way around. We are prepared to be reasonable." Richard stared first at the document in Gorman's trembling hand, then at the placid face of his wife. For the first time he saw not the quiet homemaker he had taken for granted, but a stranger, a cool, calculating opponent who had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. The gilded cage, he was beginning to realize, had not been for her at all. The door had always been open. He was the one who was trapped inside, and he had just handed her the key. The days following the meeting were a blur of frantic activity for Richard and his legal team. The bravado that had defined Richard's entire adult life evaporated, replaced by a gnawing, terrified rage. He and Gorman were holed up in the office, the so-called post-nuptial agreement spread out on the conference table between them like a declaration of war. "How could you sign this?" Richard Gorman bellowed, his face red with a mixture of fear and fury. He was terrified of losing his biggest client and the massive fees that came with him. This isn't a post-enup. It's a suicide pact. It's a complete transfer of authority. "I told you I don't remember the details," Richard shot back, pacing the room like a caged animal. "It was 14 years ago. We were rocky. I'd made a mistake, and she said she needed security. Her father had just passed away. She was emotional. She had some family lawyer draw it up. She told me it was just a formality, a way to put her name on things to make her feel like a partner. I was trying to close the Westfield Tower deal. I didn't have time to read every damn line of fine print." Well, you should have made time. Gorman jabbed a thick finger at the document. This clause here, Article 4, Section B, it's a killer. It states that in the event of a divorce, filing initiated by you predicated on no-fault grounds, but accompanied by evidence of marital infidelity, which, by the way, they have full managerial control of all jointly listed assets, and holding corporations reverts to her. Managerial control. Richard. It doesn't just split the assets, it gives her the steering wheel. The full implication was beginning to dawn on Richard, and it was horrifying. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. His entire identity was wrapped up in Hawthorne Holdings, in the power he wielded. The discovery phase of the divorce began, and it was a brutal, one-sided affair. Alistair Finch's office didn't send a trickle of requests. They opened a fire hose. They demanded decades of financial records, corporate minutes, personal and business tax returns, credit card statements, and travel itineraries. Each request was precise, targeted, and backed by an encyclopedic knowledge of Richard's business structures. Richard and Gorman tried to stonewall, to delay and obfuscate. They produced redacted documents and claimed others were lost. But Finch was relentless. For every document they withheld, he filed a motion to compel each one more sharply worded than the last. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Harriet Cole, was clearly not impressed with their tactics, granting every one of Finch's motions and warning Gorman about sanctions. Meanwhile, Richard's personal life was beginning to fray. Candace, who had envisioned a seamless transition from mistress to lady of the manor, was growing impatient. "What is taking so long?" Ricky she'd whine, perched on the edge of his temporary suite at a luxury hotel. "You said this would be quick. That woman was supposed to just take the money and disappear." "When can I move my things into the house?" "It's complicated, Candy." He'd snap, running a hand through his hair. "There are legal issues." "Legal issues. You're Richard Hawthorne. You make the issues go away." She pouted, her understanding of his power as shallow as her affection. She saw the stress etched on his face, the dark circles under his eyes, and it wasn't attractive. The powerful, confident titan she'd attached herself to was being replaced by a worried, angry man who spent his nights on the phone with his lawyer. Her calls started to go to his voicemail more often. The most damning requests from Finch's office were related to a series of holding companies Richard had set up years ago, companies with innocuous names like RJH Properties and Oak Creek Ventures. He had used them for tax purposes and to limit liability, a standard practice for a man in his position. He was the sole director, the one who made all the decisions, but as Finch's requests forced them to pull the original incorporation documents from the archives, Gorman made a discovery that made his blood run cold. He called Richard in a panic. "I'm looking at the Articles of Incorporation for Hawthorne Family Trust, LLC, Richard. The one that technically owns the mansion, the place in Aspen, and the art collection." "What about it?" Richard barked into the phone. "The sole signatory, the registered owner. It's not you. It's Samantha. It's been her since its inception in 2011. Richard felt the floor drop out from under him. "That's impossible. It's a mistake." "It's no mistake," Gorman's voice was grim. "It's right here, notarized and filed with the state. And it's not just that one. Summit Real Estate Holdings, the parent company for 3 of your commercial towers. She's listed as the majority shareholder. You're listed as the managing partner, but she holds the equity." A cold sweat broke out on Richard's brow. He remembered now. Vague conversations in a lawyer's office a decade ago. Samantha had been there quiet and composed. The lawyer had explained it was an asset protection strategy. In the event of a catastrophic business lawsuit against him personally, these assets held in Samantha's name would be shielded. It had made sense at the time. A smart, prudent measure. He had seen it as him protecting his emperor. He never imagined it was a shirt being built around him bar by invisible bar. He had been so focused on protecting his wealth from outside threats that he never thought to protect it from the silent partner sitting beside him. Finch wasn't just on a fishing expedition. He already had the map. The document requests weren't to find information. They were to force Richard to legally admit on the record what Finch already knew. He was systematically forcing Richard to hand him the nails for his own coffin. The final piece of the puzzle arrived in the form of a deposition notice for a woman named Paula Jenkins. "Who is Paula Jenkins?" Richard demanded of Gorman. Gorman looked pale. "She was your wife's personal accountant for the last 15 years. Richard was stunned. "My wife has a personal accountant. I thought my firm's people handled everything." "Apparently not," Gorman said, looking at the notice. "And according to this, Finch wants to depose her about her management of several investment portfolios and corporate entities. Entities, Richard, that we are just now realizing you don't actually own." June 2011. The rain lashed against the windows of the family lawyer's office. Not Richard's lawyer, the corporate shark Barry Gorman, but Mr. Henderson, a quiet elderly man who had handled Samantha's parents' estate. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool and old paper. Samantha sat opposite him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had lost 10 pounds in 2 months, the emotional toll of Richard's affair with the architect, having hollowed out her cheeks and put a permanent shadow in her eyes. Richard, seated beside her, was the picture of impatient contrition. He had apologized profusely. He had sworn it was a one-time mistake, a moment of weakness. He had bought her a diamond bracelet she never wore. Now he just wanted this final piece of penance to be over so he could get back to his life. So to summarize, Mr. Henderson said, peering over his spectacles, "Richard, you are proposing a post-nuptial agreement to provide Samantha with a greater sense of security and partnership in the marital estate. And as part of an asset protection strategy against potential future litigation in your line of work, you are amenable to restructuring the ownership of certain non-liquid assets." "Exactly," Richard said, eager to move things along. He had a tea time at his club in less than 2 hours. Whatever makes Sam feel secure. "I want to put this behind us. We're a team." Samantha remained silent, letting the lawyer speak. This wasn't her idea, not initially. After the raw pain of the betrayal had subsided, it had been replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She had seen her future spool out in front of her, a life of perpetual anxiety, waiting for the next indiscretion, her comfort and security entirely dependent on the whims of a man she no longer trusted. Her father's words echoed in her mind, advice he'd given her long ago. Hope is not a strategy. Security is something you build, not something you are given. So she had gone to Mr. Henderson, not just for legal advice, but for a lesson in corporate structure. For weeks they had met in secret. She had brought him every financial statement she could find, every document she had been asked to sign over the years. She absorbed the language of trusts, holding companies, and shareholder agreements with the focus of a graduate student cramming for the bar exam. She wasn't just a housewife. She had a degree in economics, a fact Richard had long forgotten, viewing it as a quaint tale from her past, like her proficiency in high school tennis. The plan she and Henderson devised was brilliant in its subtlety. It played directly into Richard's own motivations, his ego, and his fear of losing his wealth. The core of the strategy, Richard Henderson explained, is to insulate the family's primary assets. The homes, the art, even a significant portion of the real estate portfolio. Will create a series of limited liability companies and a family trust. By placing these assets into these entities, with Samantha as the primary shareholder or owner, they become shielded from any personal or professional lawsuits aimed at you or Hawthorne Holdings directly. You would, of course, retain operational control as the managing partner. It sounded perfect to Richard. It was his idea amplified. He would still run everything, call all the shots, but his most valuable possessions would be safe. It was like having a secret vault. Then came the post-nuptial agreement itself. Henderson presented it as a companion document, a way to formalize their partnership. This agreement simply states that in the event of a dissolution of the marriage, the assets will be divided equitably, Henderson said, glossing over the intricate clauses he and Samantha had spent a month drafting. And it contains a standard lifestyle clause to ensure Samantha is provided for. Richard barely glanced at the thick document. He saw the words, equitable partnership and asset protection, and they were all music to his ears. He flipped to the last page and reached for his pen. Richard, perhaps you should have Mr. Gorman review this. First, Samantha said, her voice soft. It was a calculated move, the final piece of the trap. By offering him the chance for his own counsel, she was absolving herself of any future claim of manipulation. Richard scoffed, pen hovering over the signature line. And pay Gorman $500 an hour to read something we both agree on. Don't be silly, Sam. I trust Mr. Henderson. If this makes you happy and protects our family, let's just sign it and go to lunch. He scribbled his name with a flourish. He signed the articles of incorporation for the new LLCs. He signed the trust documents. He signed page after page, his mind already on the fairway on the Henderson deal, on anything other than the tedious paperwork of his marriage. He saw it as a grand gesture of reconciliation. Samantha saw it for what it was, the transfer of an empire. Over the next 14 years, she played the part of the dutiful wife flawlessly. But behind the scenes, she was no longer a passive passenger. With the quiet guidance of her accountant, Paula Jenkins, she monitored the assets now legally under her control. She read the quarterly reports. She learned the flow of capital from one project to the next. When documents required her signature as the majority shareholder, she would review them with Paula before signing, asking quiet, intelligent questions that Richard's office staff dismissed as the idle queries of a bored spouse. She watched Richard's ego grow, his arrogance calcify. She watched him parade a series of younger women, culminating in the brazen affair with Candace, and she did nothing. She waited. She knew the agreement was her insurance policy, but it had a very specific trigger. The power shift only happened if he was the one to file for divorce. The infidelity clause was the accelerator. He had to be the one to pull the pin on the grenade. He had to be the one to walk into the trap of his own free will, blinded by his own hubris. She was not an architect of revenge, but an architect of survival. She had built a legal fortress around herself, brick by meticulous brick, using the very tools he had handed her. And she had waited with the patience of a saint and the foresight of a strategist for the day he would inevitably try to tear her life down. Only then would he discover that the foundations he thought were his had belonged to her all along. The air in Courtroom 4B was stale and heavy with the scent of old paper and simmering animosity. It was a grand, intimidating room, with dark wood paneling and a ceiling so high it seemed to absorb all sound. Richard Hawthorne walked in as if he owned the place. On his arm, in a move of spectacular arrogance, was Candace Albright. She was dressed in a tight white dress, a stark and deliberate contrast to Samantha, who sat at the plaintiff's table in a modest charcoal grey suit. Candace's presence was a calculated insult, a message to Samantha and the world that Richard had already moved on, and this was merely a financial transaction. Richard took his seat next to Barry Gorman, giving Samantha a dismissive glance. He saw the same quiet, composed woman. He refused to believe the legal nightmare Gorman had been describing for weeks. It had to be a bluff, a complex negotiating tactic. Finch was a showman, that's all. When it came down to it, a judge would see the truth. He was the creator, the earner, the one who deserved the spoils. Judge Harriet Cole entered a formidable figure in black robes, and the proceedings began. The room fell silent. Gorman rose to give his opening statement. He launched into a theatrical, almost desperate speech. He painted Richard as a visionary, a titan of industry who had single-handedly built a real estate empire from scratch. He portrayed Samantha as a woman who had lived a life of unimaginable luxury, contributing nothing but her presence. For 22 years, Mr. Hawthorne worked day and night. Gorman boomed his voice, echoing slightly in the cavernous room. He took the risks he made. The payroll he built, the skyscrapers that define this city's skyline. And what did his wife do? She attended charity lunches. She redecorated homes that Mr. Hawthorne paid for with his blood, sweat, and tears. And now, at the end of this long marriage, she seeks to cripple the very engine of commerce that provided her with that lifestyle. She wants not a fair share, but a king's ransom, a punitive, vindictive seizure of a lifetime of work. He went on for nearly 30 minutes, his arguments growing more emotional, more accusatory. He tried to frame the post-nuptial agreement as a document signed under emotional duress, a manipulative tool used by a cunning wife against a husband trying to save his marriage. Richard felt a surge of confidence. Gorman was good. He was landing punches. He looked at the jury box, though this was a bench trial he imagined one, and then at the judge. Judge Cole's face was impassive, betraying nothing. He glanced at Samantha. She hadn't flinched. She sat with her back straight, her gaze fixed on the judge, her expression serene. It was infuriating. When Gorman finally sat down, sweating and triumphant, the judge turned her gaze to the other table. "Mr. Finch, your opening statement." Alistair Finch rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not approach the judge's bench or pace the floor. He simply stood beside his table. "Your Honor." He began, his voice calm and conversational, a stark contrast to Gorman's blustering performance. "We are not here today to debate the value of Mr. Hawthorne's work ethic, or to denigrate Mrs. Hawthorne's contributions to their marriage. We are not here to engage in melodrama. We are here to read a contract." He paused, letting the simplicity of the statement sink in. "The law. Your Honor is thankfully immune to theatrics. It is concerned with facts, with documents, and with signatures. Mr. Gorman has painted a compelling picture of his client as a great builder. And in a way we agree. Mr. Hawthorne did indeed build a great many things. What he failed to do was check who owned the land upon which he was building." Finch continued his tone, never rising, his words precise and devastating. This case is not about emotion. It is about ownership. It is about a series of legally binding agreements, chief among them a post-nuptial contract entered into willingly by both parties on June the 12th, 2011. A contract that Mr. Hawthorne, a man renowned for his business acumen, signed. A contract that clearly and irrevocably outlines the disposition of assets and control in the exact circumstances we find ourselves in today. Our intention is not to argue about percentages of an empire. Our intention is to simply present the court with the legally filed, notarized, and binding proof of who owns it. He sat down. His entire opening statement had taken less than 5 minutes. It was concise, clinical, and terrifying. The confidence Richard had felt moments before began to curdle into a cold dread. The day wore on. Gorman called his first witness, Richard's longtime chief financial officer, a man named George Peterson. Gorman's plan was to have George testify to Richard's sole control and financial genius. George dutifully explained how Richard made every decision, how every dollar flowed from his directives. Then it was Finch's turn to cross-examine. "Mr. Peterson." Finch began approaching the witness stand. "You have testified that Mr. Hawthorne directs all financial activities at Hawthorne. Holdings, is that correct?" "Yes, absolutely." "He's the boss," George said confidently. "And when the company acquires a new property, say the commercial building at 125 West Avenue, who signs the final purchase agreement? Richard does." "Mr. Hawthorne." "And what if I were to tell you," Finch said, producing a document, "that the purchasing entity for that property was not Hawthorne Holdings, but a company called Summit Real Estate Holdings, LLC. Are you familiar with that entity?" George hesitated. "Yes, it's one of our holding companies. And can you tell the court who is the majority shareholder of that holding company?" George looked uncomfortable. I'd have to check the records." "No need," Finch said, placing a document on the projector. "It was the company's articles of incorporation. The records state quite clearly that the majority shareholder with 90% of the equity is Samantha Hawthorne. Is that correct?" George swallowed hard. "Yes, that appears to be correct." "So Mr. Hawthorne, your boss, was using money generated by his efforts to purchase a building that is now, for all legal intents and purposes, 90% owned by his wife, Gorman," shot to his feet. "Objection, counsel, is mischaracterizing the nature of corporate structures overruled," Judge Cole said, her eyes fixed on the document on the screen. "The witness will answer the question." George squirmed. "Yes, legally speaking." Finch continued relentlessly for the next hour. Document by document, property by property, he showed the same pattern. The Aspen Ski Lodge, owned by a trust in Samantha's name. The art collection purchased through an LLC controlled by Samantha. The stock portfolio held in a joint account with a survivorship clause that, per the post-enup, defaulted to her in the event of a divorce. With each new exhibit, Richard felt another piece of his world crumble. He was shrinking in his chair. He could feel Candace's eyes on him, her expression shifting from adoration to confusion and then to a cold, calculating horror. The king was being revealed as a jester, a man who had worked tirelessly for decades only to enrich the very woman he was now trying to cast aside. The courtroom was no longer a stage for his triumph. It was a slaughterhouse, and he was the one on the hook. The second day of the trial began with a palpable sense of doom hanging over Richard's side of the courtroom. The tide had not just turned, it had become a tsunami. Alistair Finch called his first and only witness. Paula Jenkins, the unassuming accountant, who had been on Samantha's personal payroll for 15 years. Paula was a middle-aged woman with sensible shoes and a calm professional demeanor. She was the antithesis of the high-powered, aggressive witnesses Gorman had intended to call. Under Finch's gentle questioning, she began to lay out the financial reality of the Hawthorne estate with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon. Ms. Jenkins Finch began, "Could you please describe your role in managing Mrs. Hawthorne's financial affairs?" "Certainly," Paula said, her voice clear and confident. "For the last 15 years, I have provided accounting and advisory services to Mrs. Hawthorne. This includes monitoring her personal and corporate assets, ensuring tax compliance, and providing regular reports on the performance of the entities registered in her name. And could you list for the court the primary entities for which you performed these services?" Paula put on her reading glasses and consulted a neat folder. "Of course. There is the Hawthorne Family Trust, LLC, which holds the family residences in Oak Creek and Aspen, as well as the art collection, valued at its last appraisal at approximately $30 million. Then there is Summit Real Estate Holdings, LLC, which is the parent company for 6 commercial properties downtown. And finally, the SH Investment Portfolio, a brokerage account containing a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds." With every word, Richard felt a fresh wave of nausea. He had thought his own CFO knew everything. But this woman, this complete stranger, was describing the heart of his empire as if it were her client's personal property, because he was beginning to understand with sickening certainty it was. "And these entities," Ms. Jenkins Finch continued, "were they actively managed, or were they simply passive repositories for assets?" "Oh, they were very actively managed," Paula said. "Mrs. Hawthorne and I had quarterly review meetings. She reviewed every major transaction. When Mr. Hawthorne, in his capacity as managing partner of Summit Real Estate, would propose a new acquisition, the final approval documents would come to my office for Mrs. Hawthorne's signature as majority shareholder. She always read them thoroughly." Gorman looked as if he was going to be sick. This quiet, polite woman was methodically dismantling his entire case. His portrayal of Samantha as an uninvolved, clueless spouse was being shredded. But Finch wasn't finished. He saved the masterstroke for last. "Your Honor," Finch said, addressing Judge Cole, "at this time I would like to call the court's attention to Exhibit D, the post-nuptial agreement signed by both parties." He projected the document onto the large screens in the courtroom. He highlighted Article 4, Section B, the clause Gorman had called a killer. "As the court can see," Finch announced, his voice resonating with quiet authority, "this clause is triggered by one event, a divorce petition filed by Mr. Hawthorne. Upon that filing, full and unrestricted control of all entities where Mrs. Hawthorne is the designated owner or majority shareholder is to be executed by her immediately and irrevocably. The role of managing partner held by Mr. Hawthorne is effectively terminated." He then turned to face Richard, his gaze as sharp as a scalpel. "Mr. Hawthorne, you filed for divorce on May 17th of this year. Did you not?" Richard could only nod his throat too tight to speak. By doing so, Finch declared, his voice rising for the first time, "You willingly, and with the benefit of your own legal counsel, activated this clause. You didn't just ask for a divorce, Mr. Hawthorne. You tendered your resignation." A collective gasp went through the public gallery. Gorman slumped in his chair, a defeated man. Richard stared at the document on the screen, his signature a mocking scrawl at the bottom. The trap so patiently set had been sprung. The final piece of evidence Finch submitted was a comprehensive financial summary prepared by Paula Jenkins. It showed the total value of the assets legally and exclusively in Samantha's name. The Hawthorne Mansion, the Aspen Retreat, the commercial towers, the art, the stocks. It was an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Then Finch displayed a second summary, the assets in Richard Hawthorne's name. It was a shockingly short list, a personal checking account with a modest balance, a 401k from his first job decades ago, a handful of personal effects, the clothes on his back. His name was on the company letterhead, but not on the deeds. He was the face of the brand, but he didn't own the store. "Your Honor," Finch concluded, turning back to the judge. "The evidence is clear. Mr. Gorman argued that his client built an empire and that Mrs. Hawthorne wants to take it from him. The truth is far simpler. Over the last 14 years, Mr. Hawthorne has been the most successful, most dedicated and most handsomely compensated employee of his wife's many enterprises. Now his employment has been terminated. We are not asking for a division of assets. We are merely formalizing a change in management." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The judge looked from Finch to the mountain of evidence, then to the ashen-faced man at the defendant's table. Richard's world had not just cracked. It had been utterly and completely annihilated. He looked across the room at Samantha. She met his gaze, and for the first time he saw not serenity, but a profound, sorrowful strength. It was the look of a woman who had been pushed too far, and had simply quietly and intelligently pushed back with the full force of the law. He then felt a movement beside him. It was Candace. She stood up, her face a mask of fury and disbelief, and without a single word, she turned and strode out of the courtroom, her high heels clicking an angry staccato on the marble floor. She hadn't signed up to be the mistress of a well-paid employee. She had just walked out on a man who had nothing left to offer her. Richard was well and truly alone. He had walked into court with his mistress confident of his power, but he was about to leave with absolutely nothing in his name. The judge's ruling was a mere formality, a verbal confirmation of the reality Alistair Finch had so clinically unveiled. Judge Cole spoke in dry legal terms, but her words were the final hammer blows on the coffin of Richard's old life. She affirmed the validity of the post-nuptial agreement. She confirmed Samantha Hawthorne's sole ownership and control of the trusts and corporations. She ordered Richard to vacate the Oak Creek property within 7 days. As a final crushing indignity, Finch, on Samantha's instruction, did not leave him completely destitute. Citing a clause in the agreement about providing for a spouse in the case of financial disparity, the court ordered Samantha to pay Richard a monthly alimony. It was a modest sum, enough to rent a small apartment and live a middle-class life. The amount was almost exactly what he had initially offered her. It was not an act of kindness, but a final, perfectly executed checkmate. He was to be kept provided for, just as he had planned for her. Richard sat motionless as the courtroom emptied. Gorman patted him awkwardly on the shoulder and mumbled something about an appeal, but they both knew it was hopeless. There was nothing to appeal. The contracts were ironclad, the signatures his own. He was a victim of his own arrogance. He walked out of the courthouse alone. The bright afternoon sun felt harsh and alien. The city he had once viewed as his kingdom now seemed like a foreign land. He saw Candace's car peel away from the curb down the street, not even bothering to wait for him. His phone buzzed. It was his CFO, George. He ignored it. It buzzed again. His office. He ignored that, too. They weren't his calls to take anymore. He was no longer Richard Hawthorne the Titan. He was just Richard Hawthorne, a man with a single suitcase and a court-ordered allowance paid by his ex-wife. A week later, 2 women sat at a sun-drenched table in a small cafe downtown. One was Samantha Hawthorne. She wore a simple linen dress and looked 10 years younger. The stress that had lived on her face for years had vanished, replaced by a quiet, confident calm. Across from her sat her old friend, Brenda Walsh. "I still can't believe it," Brenda said, shaking her head in amazement as she stirred her latte. "When you told me your plan all those years ago, I thought you were just dreaming. To have that kind of patience, that foresight. Sam, it's extraordinary." Samantha smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "It wasn't about revenge, Brenda. Not really. It was about respect. He had stopped respecting me as a partner, as a person. He saw me as a piece of furniture in a house he owned. I had to remind him that you should never underestimate the furniture. Sometimes it's holding up the whole house." "So what now?" Brenda asked. "Are you going to run the company? Sell it all off and travel the world?" Samantha took a sip of her tea, considering the question. For so long, my life was defined by Richard. First by loving him, then by surviving him. Now, it's mine. I think I'll start by redefining Hawthorne Holdings. More sustainable projects, better community engagement. Paula Jenkins is helping me put together a new board. I spent 20 years helping build that company from the sidelines. I think I'd like to see what I can do from the driver's seat." Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her son. "Heard the news. So proud of you, Mom. Call you tonight." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was a tear of release, not of sorrow. Miles away, Richard Hawthorne stood in the doorway of a generic 1-bedroom apartment in a faceless suburban complex. The walls were beige, the carpet was thin, and the view from the window was of a parking lot. He had a few boxes of clothes and personal effects. He looked around the empty space, a hollow ache in his chest. For years he had been obsessed with his name, with the legacy of Hawthorne. He had wanted it emblazoned on buildings, on letterheads, on the lips of the powerful. Now his name meant nothing. It was just a word on the lease for an apartment paid for by the woman he had so profoundly underestimated. He had gained the world, and in his carelessness had signed it all away, leaving him with nothing but the bitter echo of his own pride. The silence in this small, empty room was different from the silence in the mansion. That was the silence of emptiness. This was the silence of absence, the sound of a life that had been completely and irrevocably erased. The story of Richard and Samantha Hawthorne is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't always loud and aggressive. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and incredibly intelligent. Richard saw his wife as an accessory to his success, forgetting she was the silent partner, holding the very deeds to his kingdom. He learned the hard way that arrogance is a blindfold, and underestimating the person beside you can cost you everything. This wasn't a story of revenge. It was a story of reclamation. Samantha didn't just win a divorce. She claimed the life and the empire she had quietly co-owned all along. If this story of intricate planning and poetic justice resonated with you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it. Share this video with someone who loves a story of the underdog turning the tables. And most importantly, subscribe and ring the notification bell. We have many more true-life dramas and incredible stories to share, and you won't want to miss them. Thank you for listening.